Oh, I'll have a Kit Kat if you're going. No, a Star Bar. Oh, hello. Welcome to Monstrosities, Mon Amour, the podcast that gives unloved things a much-needed hug. I'm John Grindrod, author of books like Concretopia, Outskirts and Iconicon. Actually, so like Concretopia, Outskirts and Iconicon that they are, in fact, Concretopia, Outskirts and Iconicon. I was just leaving the Central Library in Milton Keynes when I spied author Rose Ruane, whose excellent latest novel Birding has been longlisted for the Women's Prize. I went to say hi, but she hit me over the head with a 1960s long-necked china cat and stuffed me in the boot of her Austin Maxi with a load of old crockery and drove us roughly 356 miles. It's nice to be out the boot, but bloody hell, Rose, where the lemony snicket are we?
We are in the centre of Glasgow and we are at the Savoy Centre, great big concrete hulk with those real knobbly textural murals on the outside with sort of cogs and lumps and bumps, vaguely suggesting some kind of industrial utopia, and great big carved blue and white letters reading the Savoy Centre, declaring this place. And there's a big office tower looming above us with huge glass windows, and there's one of those deeply futuristic overpasses that takes us to the other side of the road that we're facing away from, and we're stepping into this shopping centre that's all hard surfaces and bright lights and small shop units, every single one selling a completely different kind of thing, from tiny trinkets to high-vis workwear. There's nail bars. There's even smaller market stalls selling everything from those kind of little lead toy soldiers and vintage sort of matchbox cars and comic books and obscure paperbacks and VHS tapes, from sort of video nasties to softcore pornography to those sort of 8-hour steam train journeys. And there's a classic sort of cups of tea and, you know, scalding hot polystyrene cups of mellow birds, and the smell of like frying square sausage permeating the whole space as we walk around and are slightly dazzled by the juxtaposed array of goods and services on offer.
I mean, what's amazing about the Savoy Centre is that it feels like the kind of place that has disappeared almost everywhere, but here it's still going on. This world is still existing of quirky little independent shops and market stalls and stuff that doesn't feel like horribly corporate, despite the fact, you know, the actual building itself was definitely never some tossed up structure. It's like couldn't be more sort of controlled, this great big brutalist slab. But inside it is a sort of riot of all of this sort of independent spirit. It's a really curious place.
It's truly curious. There's also, because it's daytime, it's closed, of course, but there's quite a large nightclub whose reputation precedes it as one of those ones that's sort of never been chic or glamorous. It's always been there for people to drink, pull, and leave, and probably has served a slightly older clientele, people who are more there to go out and have a good time rather than to be looked at, rather than to be seen. Probably the kind of place that's always been the subject of slightly snide, classist joking, but that's another sort of element of the strangeness and jumbled jigsaw of elements of the uses of this place. And it's also interesting how over time, especially with it being really quite close to the Glasgow School of Art and, you know, all the latter complications of the burning down, but the school itself is still there. That building that represented it is, you know, sort of this strange inadvertent Jean-Claude and Christo wrapped in plastic for the second time. But there's still that thrumming, thriving community of young people there, where there have been attempts to sort of use some of the closed down spaces, as I understand it, within that for sort of art working spaces that haven't quite come to anything in the way that there are other places in Glasgow, as in other cities, where those sort of commercial units have become galleries or co-working spaces or studios. Maybe it's almost too close to the art school. I'm not entirely sure why, but as I understand it, there have been a couple of things that have popped up there in that way that, you know, art often goes to occupy sort of cheap commercial space in these empty units, which sort of haven't thrived in there. And I think there is one, to use like a sort of despicable, very word of the internet age, there's a very authentic budget Chinese cafeteria used by members of that community that I think has become quite influential on Instagram as a real like, oh, you must go there to this darling little place. But actually, I think that sort of, as far as the tendrils of gentrification have extended into that space, unlike other analogous spaces like the Barrows in Glasgow and in so many cities across the UK.
It's interesting to have quite a sort of large structure like that is very much not for everyone, and it isn't sort of trying to be for everyone. It's got its community and it's got a identity and personality, and it has been drawing people in for sort of decades. It opened in 1979.
It's certainly not a world away from my first experience of it, which would have been, I guess, in the early or mid 1980s during the summer holidays, where I would always have a day with my grandma, who was my dad's mum, and her partner, who I sort of called Grandad, but there was always a sense that, you know, he wasn't my dad's dad because my dad's dad had died quite young. And they were very different from my parents, who were very sort of middle class, from the working class, who I think sort of part of their self-affirmation of their sort of firm middle of the middle, we have attained middle classness, was always sort of visiting big chain stores. I spent a lot of my youth losing the will to live in and sort of freezing in the outdoor bits of B&Q where they looked at things for their rockery or their herbaceous border, or, you know, sort of lots of time wandering round Comet, you know, looking at sort of grandstand on 20 televisions at once while they updated white goods, or going around, you know, sort of furniture stores, trying out couches and that sort of thing. And they didn't use the kind of businesses that were in the Savoy Centre. So it was really revelatory, you know, was exotic to me in the way that, like, you know, sort of a market in Marrakesh would be, of all these small places with all the riches of the universe, as in, to me at that time, neon plastic jewellery and every kind of gonk and tchotchke and little ceramic kittens in boots and things that would form the rest of my identity. And then also the things that were completely baffling, those really utilitarian shops, like wool shops and places that sold like steel toe-capped boots and stuff. So it was incredibly exotic to me, and it just hasn't changed that much. Whereas other similar shopping centres around Glasgow that I grew familiar with under my own steam when I started to go into the city, and there were lots of like sort of older Victorian arcades dotted around, and then big shiny 80s postmodern shopping centres, you know, really with fountains and like, oh my God, the glass elevators of the future slash Roald Dahl. This place was more singularly itself. It was much more obviously classed. It remains so, and it is the most unchanged place, unlike the other shopping centres around it in those intervening decades.
Yeah, and that is curious, isn't it? Because actually, if you go around the country, loads of these shopping centres from this era have disappeared completely. So the Tricorn Centre, famously in Portsmouth, very similar, you know, the nightclub, sort of nightlife side of it, the shopping centre side of it, the sort of brutalist architecture, the kind of class element. All of those things were all quite similar, even though, geographically very, very far apart. I used to live right by the one in Elephant and Castle, which has been recently demolished. And that may have started out with ideas that it was going to be full of these huge kind of chains. But in fact, it was full of little shops and an amazing supermarket. And actually, they were the places that if you lived locally, you would, your community would sort of hang out in those places. Shopping centres are sort of designed to feel generic. They're designed to feel you have these sort of units that are all identical, rather than on a high street where you've got loads of actual different buildings with different shops. This place should feel really uniform. But it's so interesting that, in fact, you've got this sort of Star Wars cantina environment here where everything is going on all at once, and there is no sense of cohesion from shop to shop or customer to customer, but everybody that's going in there has got their specific mission that they're doing. It's, they're in and out, or they're sort of bustling around, or they've got their 3 shops that they always go to, and that's that. And it's almost like the rest of the place is invisible.
When I visited there with my grandparents, I was let loose on the shops that had my childlike laser focus of plastic strings of beads that would allow me to dress up as some kind of Boy George Bananarama hybrid and little tiny teddy ornaments and things like that. But actually, my grandparents were there to treat it as, an old school marketplace in the purest sense, that they were going to those separate units where there was a greengrocer and there was a hardware shop that sold cleaning products. And then, they went and got a cuppa in the little cafe that was the corner area, slightly done up to look like it was like a ye old ET Chopin with copper pans and horse brasses and things to sort of imply eternity and having been always here. And it was only really in reflecting on it that I realised how much it was one of those places that was there to serve complex community, probably people who lived near or in the city centre, rather than right across the road was the Sauchiehall Centre with its very 80s branding and its flower beds and its fountains and glass elevators that were people coming from the suburbs because there was a top shop, because there was like a pizza land or a Spudgy Like where you could have lunch, because there was, a sock shop and all those sort of exciting chains, and they were for people to come once a week or once a month, whereas the Savoy Centre was very much contained in this big brutalist edifice that slightly implies that utopian intention to serve a community, even if, time bears out that it doesn't quite do that in practice.
An interesting story about how it sort of came about as well, because that site was already, there was a ballroom and a cinema that were already being demolished, and then they burned down. And in 1972, they start building the Savoy Centre, but it doesn't open until 1979, sort of fully. And obviously the world changes at that moment. It's been built for one sort of world, but 1979 is obviously that huge hinge point in sort of British culture with the arrival of the Thatcher government and, the arrival of the 80s, really. It's a whole different world that the Savoy Centre is being sort of born into. It's not the place that it was designed to be. And in a way, the Sauchiehall Centre is sort of interesting because it's not very long after that would be, dreamt up and opening. But it's a world away sort of philosophically and because of, in terms of the design, but also in terms of why it's there and who it's to serve. It's sort of fascinating how really the Savoy Centre sort of arrives at precisely the wrong moment. Like it's just, hooray, we're a sort of 1960s bazaar, but we've arrived at the beginning of the 80s.
And I think it's really borne out that sort of in my experience, much of the clientele, not just my grandparents did skew older and always did. When I was at art school in the early 2000s, I went there a lot because I was making work out of ready-mades and I was always really interested in sort of kitsch object. I'm not saying they were any good. They were actually dreadful, but I was making sort of installations out of objects, a lot of which I bought from there. And then I was frequently the youngest person in there. And also, I just suddenly remembered there was a real old school pet shop with live animals even then, and, you know, that looked like sort of something from a Ladybird illustration where, you know, there's still like a load of miserable looking kittens in the window, or and my strong sense is still then of being sort of one of the younger people, and that if you saw other people from art school, it was because they were taking sort of slightly Martin Parr photos of very bright pink cakes and big pairs of pants and nighties hanging up in those women's wear shops that you get that seem to only sell big pants and winceyette nighties. Still, there was a real sense of, I don't know, that sort of slightly Britpop common people cultural tourism of how younger people went and navigated that space, certainly one's coming from the art school, whereas actually the people who were using it in some daily or weekly way tended to be more of pensionable age and people who probably grew up shopping for things in singular shops rather than in, you know, big supermarkets, even if it was sort of the early days of fine fare.
Feels like it comes from a culture of browsing very much, you know, that it's all about, those shops are all about spending time in them and rummaging around because you don't quite know what you're going to find. The stock is going to be a mixture of stuff that's been there for ages and stuff that's new. So, you know, even they probably don't really know what's there with the old stuff. I always find that really fascinating when you go into sort of like an old, you know, a fabric shop that's got, you know, fabric that they'd bought in the 70s as well as fabric that they bought last week. And they don't really know what's in some of the boxes because they take, you know, the staff are totally different, but they've just inherited stock that they don't really know. So that there's a sense of kind of possibility and discovery in those places that's really fantastic.
Yeah, and I think also there's sort of spaces that allow for a business model that's increasingly impossible, where people do have a small, especially in the sort of bits that were more like market stalls, you know, where the vendor was like sort of behind a counter with various things rather than also the units that you could walk into, where they were sort of an extension of someone's passion or enthusiasm or hobbies, you know, so people sort of selling old school toy soldiers or like, you know, Rollikins Dalpole Daleks or videos or secondhand books, where actually that person clearly, even at the sort of most thriving point of that retail space, probably wasn't making a lot of money, but there was some sort of sustainable version of their own Bagpuss's sort of Brian Camp bric-a-brac shop that was allowing them to feed their own hobby or collection and allowing them to serve a small community of other people who collect those things and have those interests and enthusiasms. And it sits somewhere oddly between a business and an all-consuming passion. And I think without those sorts of tiny like market-based spaces, there are fewer and fewer opportunities where people can do something like that, and not least where it's probably most profitable for people to be a sort of incorporeal entity where they do it online through eBay or things like that. But I think they're also quite formative spaces when you sort of develop a passion for a thing, where you can go and talk to the proprietor of the comic book stand who can say, oh, well, if you like that, you like this, possibly in quite a sneering way that also implies you're an idiot for not already knowing that. But still, they're a meeting point in that way, as well as in terms of things that one thinks about around the loneliness epidemic, or, you know, how older people who might meet fewer people per day have some kind of social space in the cafe or talking to shopkeepers or any of those things. There is like a big social element to those small spaces, I think.
The idea that you could find people who had a similar outlook to you or a similar interest, a similar kind of niche internal world, we're more used now to be able to sort of navigate that online. But back then, obviously, you know, you had to try and find that in the physical world. And so places like this that are full of hobbyists or full of niche interests, or even if that niche interest is sort of high-vis jackets, you know, I mean, my dad was a car mechanic and a handyman. Nothing would have delighted in more than being able to go into a shop that was just full of high-vis jackets. I mean, that would have just, you would have been in there for ages, rustling them and going, that sort of stuff's brilliant. So it's not just toy soldiers. It's sort of interesting, isn't it, that all of those things have all got a sort of obsessive quality about them.
I realised there was quite a big time lapse between when it was a fascinating space to me as a child of sort of affordable, exciting objects. My grandma and I had exactly the same taste in big plastic jewellery and small big-eyed gonks of, various species. And then going back there in the early 2000s and realising, all my interest shifted down to the other end of town, where there was a sort of similar thing happening in down one end of Argyle Street. You have the Anderson Centre, another big, complete project where there's no residential space in the Savoy Centre, but residential office, another market-style place. Then there's the big 80s classic shiny glass pyramid of the St. Ina Centre that, as so many things of that type, had a skating rink and all the things that, no one knew they wanted, and they didn't, because that quite quickly shut down. What people really wanted was a branch of knobs and knockers and Tammy Girl. And then there was the Argyle Arcade that was a real sort of Walter Benjamin Victorian arcade. That was the utopian project to me, because it had queer sex shops, it had vintage clothing, it had those sort of goth shops that sold incense, and every garment had a fringe or a skull or some kind of element of corsetry in various sort of muddy shades of crushed velvet. But there was also comic book shops and videos and, those places that sold tie-dye and whatever kind of strange, crunchy, leaves and sticks, legal highs. That probably drew a lot of people like me away from it. And then there was a going back to it in the 2000s and rediscovering it, reassessing it. Like I say, in ways that I'm not entirely proud of, because I'm aware that the way in which I talked about my fellow art students before was as if I was doing something much more noble than them, and I was, sort of noticing their terrible lizardy cultural tourism of the place. I was also doing that. And sort of thinking I was better than them because I was observing it in myself, and that's not true either.
The pitiless gaze of retrospective analysis is never a good one. While I was in the back of the car rattling around, there was a huge amount of crockery bashing against my head, and that was not ideal, I have to say. What's that all about? Why is there so much of this crockery in the back of the boot?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because that is my vast collection of Eternal Beau crockery, and it truly is vast because it was produced as one of the vastest, most extensive ranges of crockery and kitchenalia that has ever existed. This emblem of the 80s. I feel like if Eternal Beau had a soundtrack, it would be Sue Pollard starting together. It's very much the late 80s, early 90s, wedding list, crockery, hexagonal, because we're starting to live in a better future. So who needs round plates?
I know, exactly. You want things that could just fall off the edge, stuff that isn't shaped like food.
Yeah, absolutely. And also has a very prim, very Thatcher-Major appropriate, small tasteful flowers and pink bows round it. And actually, I have to confess that I was just taking that somewhere else for someone else, Governor, because actually I don't personally collect Eternal Beau. I have a vast collection of 60s and 70s kitsch. I've got some horrible 80s and 90s kitsch. I collect a range. It's Franklin Mint, Le Cordon Bleu, that's obnoxiously embellished jelly molds that acknowledge their complete lack of utility by having, a little pinhole so that you can hang them on the wall, and tiny spice jars that have, knobbles of flowers and swags and tails. Very similar to Eternal Beau, but camper. But I'm absolutely fascinated by the sort of not quite kitsch of Eternal Beau, that kind of outmoded object. I mean, I was amazed when I looked, and actually Eternal Beau was produced as late as 2013.
No.
As 2013. I think it was in probably quite sad decline and probably being produced in smaller and smaller numbers, as opposed to, I mean, I think there was probably 3 different double-page spreads of Eternal Beau in the Argos catalogue in the late 80s and early 90s, because you could, not just the crockery, but you could get tablecloths, saucepans, there was a clock, you could pattern your entire house.
It's sort of interesting, isn't it? Because it's introduced in 81. It's amazing that it lasts that long, but also amazing that it becomes such a phenomenon. I mean, Johnson Brothers, who were the manufacturers of it, were just a 19th century Stoke pottery, but they'd never had such a successful design. And my God, did they milk it? I mean, they did everything you could possibly do with it. I mean, it is extraordinary the amount of stuff that you could get out of that one pattern. And I was sort of fascinated. The woman that designed it, Serena Mascheroni, she was a fabric designer primarily, I think. And so she wasn't actually a potter or a pottery designer. She was basically just sending these patterns out on spec. And she got this idea of sort of sophistication. There's an amazing interview with her in the New York Times in 1978, where she's talking about her design process. And she's talking about trying to do something to appeal to a sort of broad, sophisticated audience. And then 2 years later, she designs what becomes Eternal Beau. Eternal Beau, we should point out as well, that it's not spelt B-O-W, it's B-E-A-U.
And I'm fascinated by that because it feels like sort of so central to it is an idea of some kind of chaste romance. It feels very Barbara Cartland in that kind of specific heteronormative romantic idea where there's a lot of longing looks and chaste pecs, but no sort of conjugal ugliness. When I thought of which sort of collection or which kind of object to fill the boot of the Austen maxi with, it wasn't the things that I have huge affection for, like the sort of long-necked cats and big-eyed children or any of those things, because I think they're actually very rehabilitated as objects. And the thing that fascinates me about Eternal Beau is partly it's not really grotesque enough to be kitsch. It slightly has slipped through a crack in time where, like even unlike the things from the similar era that I collect that are sort of, very baroquely, kitschly, cutie pie, like Diary of an Edwardian Country Lady on crack and steroids with, those sort of weeds and veg and fruit and little lamekins sprouting in 3 dimensions from every surface. That Eternal Beau is sort of too kitsch to sort of be any kind of good taste, like sort of, East German studio pottery. But it, it's neither good taste nor bad taste. It's not grotesque enough to be kitsch and it's not chic enough to be daily use. And I'm really fascinated by the things from that sort of like 80s into 90s Thatcher into like Major's deeply beige Britain of drabness and all the kind of quietly vicious moral police force of that exists, like things like Eternal Beau, where, people's nostalgia for it is entirely like my parents had that or my grandparents had that. I don't think really many people are collecting it or displaying it or putting it on their Instagram accounts of like cute, cool things that they thrifted or amazing things from Oxfam. I think probably a lot of it is still in the cupboards of those original striking together sort of Ken and Deirdre bullseye contestant couples where, I don't know, is it kept for good? Is it daily use? Again, it's not, it exists in a funny betwixt, I think, that fascinates me and is of that world of things that, I think just might have skipped a generation of nostalgia where we're normally, nostalgia is generated by something that's slightly before us, like slightly what our grandparents had rather than quite what we grew up with in our own homes. I don't think people with architect glasses and smocks and big acrylic jewellery are ever going to do up their homes in the tripartite, like that sort of vaguely, it's a stately home but it's jazzy, like funky conservatism of the late 80s and early 90s. I just don't think that's coming back around, and that's part of why I find it so very interesting, is the general lack of affection for it and it having skipped a stage in the irony cycle, maybe because it just took itself far too seriously and wasn't camp enough in the first place.
I agree. There is something kind of slightly joyless about it, isn't there? It's got a kind of neighbourhood watch vibe to it as a pattern. It's quite shy. It's a bit Norma Major.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of twee without being cute. It's pink without being camp. My most sort of high Gothic relationship to it is like, you know, those little swags and tails of prim, prissy little pussy bows are a fucking electric fence. They are barbed wire stopping you from getting out, and, you know, and they're like sort of deeply strangling. And I think that, you know, it just has that small, tight, everything's nice. We are nice people. This is a nice plate with a nice pattern in our nice home. And so to me, I find it sort of fascinatingly represents that very, yeah, to my mind, stifling. Yeah, it's the most heteronormative crockery pattern.
Official.
I can imagine. Yeah, it's the, you know, sort of the official Olympic mascot of the 1990 heteronormativity Olympics.
Yeah, if you could redesign the Olympic rings, but only with very pale pink bows with a tiny red campion going around them, then that would be the Eternal Beau version. Well, I mean, what an absolute delight to talk to you about these things. That's absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. The world just feels like a different and better place through talking about those things with you, Rose. That's so brilliant.
Oh, the feeling is fiercely mutual. Thank you so much for inviting me. I've had a lovely time.
Lovely time. There we are. You've got away with it. You've got your blank checkbook and pen. It's lovely. And where can people carry on this amazing love affair with your work?
Nowhere exciting. Social media, Instagram, Blue Sky, and in my 2 novels that are published by Corsair that deal with very similar concerns of niceness, tweeness, collecting things, daily shopping routines, and strangling middle-class suburbia. This is Yesterday and Birding, that are both published by Corsair but soon available in all good bookshops now, and I don't think there is one in the Savoy Centre. So there's a Waterstones across the road. You can go and buy it from Waterstones in Glasgow and go and have a good old flanner around the Savoy Centre while you're there.
Fabulous. That sounds like an amazing idea. Well, amazing to talk to you, and go back and enjoy the gonks and delights of the Savoy Centre. Ta-ra. Thank you so much for listening. Monstrosities Mon Amour was created, presented and edited, no really, by John Grindrod. The theme tune is by Lorna Rees and Rufus Rees-Kashan, and the logo by Richard de Passando. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can go to my Substack. Allez tout droit!